Have you ever had a controlling neighbor? Someone who stalks you, complains unreasonably, and makes your life hell? I had one, and instead of putting up with it, I fought back. From false police calls to vile retaliation, she did everything she could to bring my family to heel. But this time, it was the troublemaker who had to go. Watch until the end to see how I took down the most toxic neighbor ever. But don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any crazy HOA stories. I remember the excitement when our family moved to Lakewood Hills, a quiet residential neighborhood just outside Austin, Texas. After years of living in the hustle and bustle of the city, my wife Emily and I decided to find the perfect place to raise our children. Our 10-year-old Jake and 7-year-old Lily have always loved having plenty of space to run around, and our new home had everything we wanted: a large backyard, a nearby playground, and tree-lined bike path. The first few days were wonderful. The neighbors seemed friendly. A few stopped to say hello as we packed, and the neighborhood kids ran across the yard, laughing and playing. I thought, this is the perfect place to start a new life. But then I noticed something strange. There was a house across the street, with its windows always closed, its curtains drawn, and a woman standing on the porch, watching everything with an uneasy gaze. Linda Harper. The first time I saw her was on the afternoon of the second day after moving in. I was dragging the trash can to the curb when I saw her standing on the porch with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was no smile, no welcome to the neighborhood like the other neighbors, just an unfriendly look. When I nodded, she just snorted and turned to go back into the house. I thought maybe she was just an introvert, not much of a social butterfly. But I was wrong. Over the next few days, I began to feel her presence everywhere. Whenever the kids were running around in the yard, if I was mending the fence, even if Emily was watering the plants on the front porch, I could feel her gaze. A critical, uncomfortable gaze. At first, I tried to ignore it. Every neighborhood has a difficult person, and if she hadn't done anything directly to affect my family, I didn't want to bother. But then the first signs appeared. One Sunday morning, while I was fixing the swing in the backyard, Lily came running in with a confused look on her face. "Dad, my aunt said I can't play here anymore." I frowned. "Who told you that?" "The neighbor across the street. She said I was making too much noise, and if I ran around again, she was going to call the police." I looked up across the street. Linda was standing on the porch, arms crossed, staring at my house as if waiting for a response. I was about to let it go, thinking maybe it was just a misunderstanding, but when I started hearing whispers from other neighbors, I knew it wasn't as simple as I thought. A young mother who lives 2 doors down from me recounted that Linda had called the HOA because her son was playing soccer in the front yard. An older man said she had reported a family for leaving their yard lights on too bright at night. Another whispered that she had driven at least 3 families away in the past 2 years. At this point, I began to realize Linda Harper was more than just a difficult neighbor. She was a control freak. I had hoped that as long as my family didn't do anything to upset her, things would go smoothly. But I had underestimated Linda. Very underestimated. I had tried to ignore Linda Harper, really. I had thought that if my family didn't confront her, if we just went about our normal lives without the sidelong glances and nagging, then maybe she would get bored and find someone else to nitpick. But I was wrong, and I was wrong in ways I never imagined. One beautiful Saturday afternoon, Jake and Lily were playing tag in the yard. The children's giggles echoed in the air, mixed with the rustling of leaves in the sunset. I sat on the porch steps, sipping coffee, enjoying the simple peace of family life. Emily was watering the flower beds in front of the house, and everything was perfect. Until a police car slowed to a stop in front of my house. I blinked, staring at the red and blue lights flashing on the hood. For a moment, I thought someone in the neighborhood had had a problem. But when the car door opened and a police officer stepped out, his eyes scanning my yard and stopping on me, a bad feeling immediately came over me. And then I saw Linda Harper standing at the head of the street with her arms crossed, her lips curled into a satisfied smile. My heart clenched. I stood up and walked slowly toward the police officer, trying to keep my composure. "What's going on, officer?" The police officer, a middle-aged man with a tired face, flipped through his notebook. "We've received a report of a public disturbance at this address." I raised my eyebrows, feeling like I'd misheard. Disorder? I turned my head, looking at Jake and Lily running around the yard, giggling to each other. If this was considered a disturbance, then the whole country could be arrested. Linda, not waiting a second, rushed forward before I could open my mouth. "That's right. These kids are screaming and running around like wild animals all day long. I've warned this family many times, but they don't listen, to the point where I can't rest in my own home." She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes filled with triumph. I glanced at the policeman, waiting seriously to see how he would react. He sighed, turned to me. "Do you have anything to say?" I stifled a dry laugh and shook my head. "Officer, the kids were just playing in their yard. Besides, it's only—" I looked at my watch. About 5:30 p.m. The policeman raised an eyebrow. It was obvious that he had noticed the absurdity of the situation. He turned to Linda, his tone slow but firm. "Ma'am, playing in your yard is not a violation of the law." Linda gasped, as if she had just been doused with cold water, but she wouldn't give up so easily. "But they're too loud. I have the right to peace in this residential area. This is a violation of the noise ordinance." I wanted to laugh, but before I could, the officer replied firmly. "Ms. Harper, there is no law against children laughing during the day. If you want absolute peace and quiet, perhaps you should consider moving to a senior living area." I saw Linda's face twitch, but the best moment was when the officer flipped back through his notebook and looked at her with a meaningful look. "Have you ever called in a false report before?" I swear I saw Linda take a step back. I just want peace and quiet," she stammered, her eyes darting around. The officer nodded, jotting a few notes in his notebook. "Ms. Harper, I'll take this as a warning. If you continue to misuse the emergency line for unwarranted incidents, you may be charged with filing a false report. Have a good evening." I stood there, savoring the sweet moment as the blush rose to Linda's face. She didn't say anything else, just stomped away, mumbled something, and stormed back into the house. The officer glanced at me, sighed, and turned back to his car. "Good luck with her." I smiled faintly. "I think I'll need more than luck." The police car rolled away, leaving an eerie silence on the street. Jake and Lily, still clueless as to what had just happened, ran up to me grinning. "Dad, can we still play?" I looked at them, seeing their innocent eyes, untouched by the troubles of the adult world. I smiled. "Of course, and maybe—" I lowered my voice as if sharing a secret. "I think we can play a little louder." The kids cheered, running toward the yard, and this time I didn't care if Linda was watching, because the real battle had just begun. I thought that after the shock of being warned by the police, Linda Harper would realize that she had gone too far. I thought that she would know when to stop, that maybe she was just being a difficult person who didn't really want to start a fight with the whole neighborhood. But I was wrong again. And this time, Linda wasn't just being a difficult person. She really wanted to get even. The next morning, I went out to the yard to get the newspaper and stopped. Lily and Jake's bright drawings were now just smudges, rainbows, suns, cute animals, all deliberately ruined by someone. Looking up, I saw Linda Harper standing on the porch across the street, holding a cup of coffee, a crooked smile. She didn't speak, but her eyes said it all. I held back my anger, not letting her win. Taking a deep breath, I called Lily out. "Do you want to do it again?" She sniffled at the messy sidewalk, then nodded. So we sat down and started over. A brighter sun, a bigger rainbow, bright flowers stretching out. Linda Harper stood still, her face dark, but I didn't care. I thought that was her only revenge. But she didn't stop. Less than 48 hours later, a letter from the HOA management showed up in my mailbox. When I opened it, I read in disbelief, "Dear David Carter residents, we have received a complaint from a neighborhood member regarding disruptive behavior and excessive noise violations. Please ensure that outdoor activities are kept to a minimum after 6 p.m. to maintain peace and quiet in the area." I almost burst out laughing. She was up to the same trick again. This time I didn't bother to react. I left the letter on the table and spent the afternoon sitting outside, watching the kids run around and play without lowering my volume. I knew Linda was watching. I knew she was waiting for my reaction, but I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Then came the second letter. "We have received a report of littering in front of your home. Please be aware that you are keeping the area clean." I frowned. My family had never littered, but that morning, outside my front door, I found crumpled candy wrappers, empty paper cups, and a few pieces of paper. I didn't have to guess to know who did it. Linda wasn't just harassing me. She wanted to make me the offender. Within a week, I received 4 more letters from the HOA, all with all sorts of ridiculous accusations. The grass in my yard is too long. My car is parked illegally. The kids are riding their bikes in the wrong lane. Each time I knew exactly who was behind it. But what surprised me was that when I asked some of my neighbors, none of them had received any letters from the HOA. It was just me. I couldn't let Linda Harper continue to run wild. Her vandalizing my kids' drawings might have been childish and spiteful, but the fake complaints she sent to the HOA board were too much. She was trying to paint a false picture of my family, to make us the ones who violated the neighborhood rules, to make my family the sole target, and I knew that if I let it go, it wouldn't stop. I had to turn things around. I checked my security cameras, which had started out as a way to protect my family but had now become my most powerful weapon. Rewinding the footage, I wasn't surprised to see Linda Harper furtively littering in front of my house. She'd come out early in the morning, grab a small trash bag, look around, and quickly dump the paper and paper cups on the sidewalk before hurrying back. Without the cameras, I wouldn't have been able to prove her dirty tricks. But I didn't stop there. If Linda had done this to me, I was sure she'd done it to someone else. I started talking to my neighbors, asking if they'd ever had trouble with her. And I didn't expect the whole neighborhood to have the same story. Angela Parker, who lived 2 doors down from me, said she'd been warned by the HOA last year about a dumpster parked in front of her house, even though it was her son's car coming home for the holidays. The reporter, Linda Harper. James Carter, a lone man who lives down the street, recalled Linda calling the police because he was sitting on his porch drinking beer at night, which she said was behavior that is not appropriate for a nice neighborhood. The Williamses, a young family with small children, said they had received dozens of letters of complaint from the HOA over the past 2 years, mostly about child noise, toys left in the yard, overly bright Christmas lights, all stemming from Linda. The list went on and on. I took notes from each of them, gathering evidence from people who had been harassed by Linda over the years. Some neighbors had even filed complaints against Linda with the HOA, but no one had pursued them, thinking they weren't worth the trouble. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't going to let Linda get away. I continued to scan my security cameras, rewinding back to the days before I received the first complaint, and then I saw what outraged me the most. A scene around 2 a.m. of Linda sneaking out of her house, carrying a bucket of water, and walking toward my sidewalk. In a matter of seconds, she dumped the entire bucket of water all over Lily and Jake's chalk drawings, then quickly turned and ran back home as if nothing had happened. I stared at the screen. Anger boiled in my chest. Linda wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was a control freak to the point of being pathological. With everything I had gathered, videos, neighbors' testimonies, letters from the HOA, even photos taken by other families as evidence, I knew I had enough to topple Linda once and for all. She'd lived too long thinking she could harass people with impunity, but this time she'd picked the wrong person to mess with. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. The game was up, and I held the last card. The next morning, I went straight to the community board office. The complaint officer, Greg Patterson, was a tough-looking, weary, middle-aged man who was clearly used to trouble in the neighborhood. I put the file down on the desk and laid out everything: the unfounded complaints, the unprovoked police calls, the years of harassment Linda had been causing. When I opened my laptop and played the video of her vandalizing chalk art and sneaking around in front of my house, Greg was silent, but I saw his hands tighten. After a moment of silence, he sighed, flipped through the file, and muttered, "It's not just your family. We've had dozens of complaints against her over the years, but no one has ever had this much evidence." Less than a week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Instead of the small meeting room at the community center, they had to move to a larger one because of the large turnout. News of Linda's investigation spread quickly, and apparently I wasn't the only one who wanted her held accountable. I arrived early, but I wasn't the first. Several neighbors were already sitting, their eyes shining with anticipation and anger. They'd been waiting for this moment. Then Linda appeared. She walked in with a haughty air, as if she were the one wronged and this was all some kind of farce. She held a thick file in her hands, probably filled with some kind of excuse or complaint. But when Greg stood up and began to explain his case, I saw her shoulders stiffen. They were out in the open. Greg showed me the video of Linda smearing the sidewalk and littering it in front of my house, then presented evidence of the fake complaints she'd filed over the years. He read the neighbors' accusations aloud, each sentence cutting into her self-satisfied shell. For the first time, Linda Harper was silent. No crossed arms, no smirk, just a look of bewilderment as she realized she'd gone too far. Greg didn't drag it out. When the final evidence was presented, he announced, Linda Harper was fined $2,500 and banned from filing complaints for 2 years. If she did anything else, the HOA would consider stronger legal action, including removing her from the community. The room was filled with satisfaction. Some nodded, some applauded, some even laughed. But Linda was silent. She stood up slowly, her face red, her hands clasped tightly around the file. No one defended, no one opposed the HOA's decision. For the first time, Linda Harper truly lost power. She looked around, hoping to find a supporter, but received only indifferent looks. In absolute silence, she turned and left the room. The door closed behind her. No one spoke. We just looked at each other, knowing that an era had ended. I stood up, walked out, and took a deep breath. I did it. Linda Harper was finally going to face the consequences of what she had done, and this time she would not have the opportunity to continue harassing anyone. I had thought that after the HOA meeting, Linda Harper would understand that she had no choice but to stay silent and accept defeat, but it turned out I had underestimated her pride. Linda was not the type of person who would stop when she had gone too far. She was the type of person who would struggle, even if it meant sinking into the mud of her own making. Just 3 days after the meeting, one morning when I went out to get the paper, I found a thick white envelope in the mailbox. It wasn't just my house. I realized that most of the houses in the community had received a similar envelope. I opened it and immediately felt both surprised and amused. Dear Lakewood Hills residents, I am concerned about the abuse of power by the HOA board when they held an unfair meeting to smear and scapegoat me. If we don't stand up, who will be next? I urge everyone to sign the petition asking for a vote to replace the board with fair people who truly care about the common good. Below was a blank list for signatures with a reminder that anyone who refused to sign would be taken note, which is another way of saying a veiled threat. I shook my head, unable to believe she would do such a thing. I wasn't the only one who reacted that way. That same day, news of Linda's letter spread throughout the neighborhood. Resident chat groups exploded with messages, most of them expressing anger and contempt. Linda Harper was not only refusing to admit her mistake, but was also trying to turn the tables by winning over the people she had harassed for years. But this time her tactics backfired spectacularly. Instead of gathering signatures to overthrow the HOA, she only angered more people. Some residents who had previously quietly tolerated Linda decided to file formal complaints against her. People who had previously been reluctantly silent began to speak out about what they had endured under her harassment. At first, it was just a private conversation between neighbors. Then it became a written complaint to the HOA, and then a formal complaint. One mother said Linda yelled at her son because a ball had flown into her yard. A man received a warning in the mail, threatened with police if he continued to host BBQs. A young couple who had been harassed by Linda since they first moved in were repeatedly warned for violations she made up. The list grew, and when the HOA received more than a dozen new complaints in a week, it couldn't ignore them. Greg Patterson sent a notice to the entire neighborhood stating that residents who had been harassed by Linda could file a complaint to see if they could be punished. He emphasized that her petitions were worthless and that any threats could be reported to the law. Linda was officially isolated. No signatures, no supporters, no one to fear the same old intimidation tactics. Instead of leading the movement to overthrow the HOA, she became the public enemy of the entire neighborhood. I didn't need to do anything more. Linda Harper dug her own grave. 3 days after the HOA's final notice, I received a final letter from Linda. No more lengthy threats, just 3 words scrawled on a piece of paper. You will regret it. I laughed and threw it straight into the trash. I wasn't one to regret it, but Linda Harper was. She might be a harasser, a bad neighbor, a control freak, but she wasn't one to accept defeat. I thought that when her plan to overthrow the HOA collapsed, the neighborhood turned against her and the complaints piled up, she would stop. But Linda Harper didn't give up easily. In the days that followed, I began to notice a strange change. Linda stopped showing up on the porch as often. No more stares when I walked outside, no more ridiculous complaints, no more veiled threats. She stopped calling the police, sending anonymous letters, showing up at HOA meetings. But I knew she wasn't giving up. She was just thinking about her next move. And then the for sale sign appeared on her doorstep. It was planted so forcefully in the yard as if Linda had slammed it into the ground herself in a fit of rage. There was no announcement, no farewell, no warning to anyone in the neighborhood. One morning the sign had been there, standing tall like a sign of surrender, but even when she decided to leave, Linda couldn't accept defeat peacefully. Over the next few weeks, I watched her silently move each box to her car, her face sullen and angry. No neighbors offered to help, no one asked. No one seemed to care that she was leaving. She had made herself an outcast, and now she had to face the consequences. I watched from a distance, saying nothing, but I knew, deep inside, she was seething. In the days after Linda Harper left, the neighborhood was transformed. There was no more tension when someone opened their door and stepped out onto the street. No more scrutinizing eyes peering through the curtains. No more unreasonable warning letters from the HOA stemming from unreasonable complaints. The silence was not scary. It was comforting. It was not a silence of control and anxiety, but of true peace. For the first time in months, I walked out into the yard without having to worry about who was watching. Jake and Lily ran freely without anyone threatening to call the police. Neighbors began opening their doors more often, standing and talking to each other instead of hurrying past with their heads down to avoid Linda's presence. No one whispered, afraid to say a name. Late one afternoon, as I was watering my plants, I noticed something I had never noticed before. The sounds of life had returned. Children's laughter, the radio from the neighbors, adults chatting freely in the yard. It was as it should have been, but it had been buried by years of tension caused by Linda Harper. And then, a new family moved in. Linda's house, once a bastion of complaints, was now painted in brighter colors. A welcome sign appeared on the front door, and soon I watched a young couple and their 2 small children move in. There were no questioning eyes. No one stood on the porch staring like an invisible gatekeeper. A few days later, as I sat on the front steps sipping coffee, I noticed the new kids drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. They were scribbling rainbows, flowers, and sparkling stars, just as Lily and Jake had done. But this time no one came to vandalize them. No one was sneaking out at night with a bucket of water to wipe away the childish joy. Lily ran to me, her eyes sparkling. "Daddy, can I go play with my friends?" I looked at her, at the colorful graffiti on the sidewalk, at the neighborhood that had regained its vitality. I smiled. "Of course, honey, and this time you can draw as much as you want." Peace had finally returned, and this time it would never be taken away again. She couldn't accept the fact that she had lost control. There was no one left to threaten, no one left to manipulate, no power left to abuse. She had lost what she held most dear, her dominance over the neighborhood.